August 12, 1945. The sun over central Texas burned white against a sky that had forgotten what clouds looked like. Heat shimmered over the fields where cotton once grew. And now the land was surrounded by barbed wire, wooden towers, and the smell of dust mixed with diesel. Inside the fence stood hundreds of men, lean and silent, their khaki shirts darkened by sweat. They were soldiers of a vanished empire, far from the islands they once swore to die for. A low rumble echoed across the yard as an army truck rolled through the gates. Its sides glistened with moisture, a rare sight in the Texan summer. The vehicle stopped beside the mess hall, and two guards jumped down. They lifted a heavy lid from a steel barrel, releasing a plume of cold air that shimmered like smoke. In their hands were scoops and paper cups. The prisoners exchanged looks. They whispered in Japanese. The words spread through the ranks. Poison, humiliation, trick. For years they had been told the enemy would show no mercy. Their officers had drilled into them that capture meant disgrace, and that Americans were monsters. Now those same monsters were offering them something cold and white, a taste of home and childhood that none had known since before the war. A young prisoner at the front of the line hesitated. He was a former Navy cook who had survived Saipan. His hands trembled as he accepted the cup. The guard nodded once, not unkindly. The prisoner lifted it to his lips, expecting bitterness or pain. Instead, there was sweetness, soft, clean, and impossibly cold. He froze, eyes wide, then took another bite. A murmur rippled through the line. Someone laughed. A sound that cracked the tension like thunder. The others stepped forward. Paper cups passed from hand to hand. In the sweltering heat of Texas, men who once shouted battle cries in the jungles of the Pacific now closed their eyes and tasted vanilla. It was too simple to believe, too gentle to understand. Across the ocean, American bombers were scattering leaflets over Japan, promising that prisoners in U.S. custody were being treated humanely. Those words, falling on ruined cities, sounded like propaganda. But here on this ranch-turned-prison, the promise was real. It melted in their mouths. By the time the sun dipped low, the barrels were empty. The guards leaned back against the truck, lighting cigarettes, watching their captives laugh like schoolboys. In that moment, the war's distance collapsed. No gunfire, no orders, just the hum of a generator and the taste of something that should not have existed in war. For these men who had marched through fire and hunger, mercy came not as a speech or surrender document. It came in a paper cup filled with ice cream. And for the first time since their defeat, they felt not humiliation, but wonder. Before they ever saw the wide skies of Texas, these men had lived by a single command: never surrender. From childhood, they were taught that death was duty and capture was rot. In school books, in shrines, in training camps, the lesson was carved into their bones. A soldier of the emperor must die as a jewel shatters, brilliant and whole. Surrender meant shame, exile, the ruin of one's name for generations. They had seen what happened to those who defied that code. In the jungles of New Guinea and the caves of Saipan, officers carried grenades not to throw but to press against their chests. Propaganda posters showed smiling Americans holding knives, their faces distorted into beasts. Prisoners, they were told, were mutilated, eaten, turned into spectacles. They were taught to believe mercy did not exist beyond the home islands. And yet, as the empire shrank and the Pacific turned red, thousands were captured, burned, wounded, too weak to die. They expected the worst. On the ships that carried them east, they waited for the slaughter that never came. When the transports reached California, they braced for interrogation, for pain, for the end. Instead, guards handed them blankets. Doctors cleaned their wounds. Translators spoke politely through interpreters. The confusion was almost worse than fear. At Camp Hearne, that confusion hardened into disbelief. The fences were high, but the guards were calm. Orders were firm, but there was no hatred in their tone. There were rules for everything: work, meals, mail, even recreation. Movies were screened. Music played on Saturday nights. Baseball fields appeared where cotton once grew. Some of the prisoners began to smile when the guards passed. Others looked away in disgust, ashamed to see comfort where they had expected cruelty. One captured lieutenant wrote in his diary, "I do not understand these people. They are enemies, but they feed us better than we fed our own." His words were confiscated by censors, but they survived in the archive, the quiet evidence of a myth cracking apart. The old belief said that compassion was camouflage, that mercy hid the knife. But the days kept passing, and the knife never came. What came instead were meals, music, and a feeling more dangerous than pain: doubt. By the summer of 1945, the prisoners of Camp Hearne had begun to sense that their world had lied to them. The Empire had promised purity through sacrifice. America offered comfort through excess. Between those two visions stood a question no sword could answer. What if mercy was not weakness, but strength? That question lingered in the hot Texas air, waiting for the day when sweetness itself would finish the lesson. By 1944, the United States had built something the world had never seen before: a network for captivity as vast as an empire. From the forests of Wisconsin to the plains of Texas, more than 500 camps rose from farmland and scrub. Each was planned with military precision: watchtowers, barracks, kitchens, and infirmaries, all run on the same clock. Camp Hearne was one of them. 700 acres of Texas soil fenced off with barbed wire and floodlights, divided into compounds by rank and nationality. Its wooden buildings were painted the color of dust. Trucks arrived daily, unloading sacks of flour, barrels of milk, crates of canned fruit, and paper-stamped U.S. Army property. The food that filled the bellies of the captured came from the same supply chain that fed the armies pushing through Europe. The War Department's philosophy was simple: efficiency first, brutality never. It cost less to keep men alive than to bury them. A live prisoner could work, a corpse could not. And beyond that calculation was something deeper, something ideological. America wanted its enemies to see a functioning machine, a civilization of abundance. Every meal, every orderly schedule, every unarmed interaction between guard and captive was part of that demonstration. Inside the camp, days unfolded like factory shifts. Morning roll call, breakfast at 6, work details at 7. Some prisoners were sent to nearby farms, others to lumber yards or canning plants. Their pay, 80 cents a day, went into a ledger to offset the cost of the program. The entire system paid for itself. Local farmers benefited. Cotton fields that might have gone unharvested were picked clean by men who had once carried rifles. American newspapers called it captivity put to work. For the prisoners, it was disorienting, an enemy who offered not only life but employment. Life in Hearne followed the rhythm of a small town. The camp had a theater, a library, a chapel. POWs could order books from the Red Cross, even borrow instruments to form orchestras. Mail arrived weekly. Letters were censored but always delivered. Some men began to learn English. Some studied American agriculture, wondering how such abundance could exist in wartime. In every routine detail, the message repeated itself: this is what a system built on order can achieve. No slogans, no speeches, just food, structure, and power expressed through calm. The empire that had promised them glory through sacrifice had built a world of scarcity and death. Here, in the enemy's land, they found abundance organized into policy. The same machinery that forged tanks and planes now maintained them, 3 meals a day, behind fences that felt less like punishment and more like proof. It was a kind of quiet warfare, fought not with bullets, but with schedules and supply trucks. And for those who lived inside it, the realization grew unbearable. The enemy they had been taught to despise had turned mercy into an industry and made it work. Numbers have no emotion. yet in war they can wound more deeply than shrapnel. By 1945, America's arithmetic of mercy had become as overwhelming as its arsenal of steel. Within the borders of the United States, 425,000 Axis prisoners of war were fed, clothed, and sheltered each day. It was a population larger than many American cities, managed with the discipline of an assembly line. Each prisoner received about 3,000 calories daily. Their meals included meat, vegetables, sugar, milk, and coffee. It was more than what many Allied civilians were consuming in Europe. It was far more than what Japanese soldiers still fighting in the jungles could dream of. A man captured by Americans ate better in captivity than his comrade did in battle. The paperwork behind that reality was staggering. 511 camps stretched across 46 states, supervised by the Army Service Forces. Trains carried food from the Midwest, milk from local dairies, and sugar from Louisiana refineries. Every delivery was logged by date, tonnage, and destination. Camp Hearne's weekly ration sheets read like grocery lists for a small city. 1,200 pounds of beef, 600 pounds of flour, 200 gallons of milk, 40 pounds of coffee, and barrels of fruit. Nothing about it was sentimental. It was logistics, pure and exact. The same supply system that fueled invasions and air campaigns also maintained a hidden nation of captives. Where other armies saw prisoners as burdens, the United States saw them as part of the machinery of war, another process to be optimized. The contrast with their homeland was brutal. In 1945, a Japanese infantryman in the Philippines might survive on 900 calories a day. Rice mixed with grass, a few dried fish, sometimes nothing at all. Disease and hunger killed more soldiers than bullets. In Germany, the average civilian ration had dropped below 2,000 calories. Meanwhile, behind American fences, the defeated ate until they were full. The math exposed the truth. America's power was not only in weapons, but in the ability to make comfort routine. It could spare calories for its enemies and still have enough to feed its armies and its citizens. The prisoners saw it in every bite, the taste of an economy that never ran empty. To men who had been taught that compassion was weakness, this arithmetic was terrifying. How could a nation so generous also be so unstoppable? The answer was in the numbers themselves. Industry had turned kindness into capacity. And capacity, multiplied across a continent, had become invincible. In Texas, the figures were simple. 3,000 calories a day, 0 recorded starvation deaths, and thousands of men who began to question everything they had believed. The math of destruction had been replaced by the math of humanity. And in that equation, mercy won. The Texas sun hung heavy over the camp, a white coin in a pale sky. The air smelled of dust and diesel, and the sound of cicadas filled every corner. The prisoners had finished their work details in the fields and were lined up for roll call when the first truck appeared at the gate. It was not an ammunition convoy or a supply run. Its sides gleamed wet with condensation, and from inside came a faint mechanical hum, a rhythm unlike anything they had heard since leaving home. The guards shouted orders. The truck backed into the open yard, leaving 2 dark tracks on the gravel. The rear flap lifted, and a wave of cold air drifted out, carrying with it the sharp scent of milk and sugar. Inside stood a squat machine with a metal crank surrounded by buckets of ice and salt. A soldier in a stained apron was already scooping something white into paper cups. The Japanese prisoners watched in silence. Their faces were drawn, wary, disbelieving. One of them whispered, "They are mocking us." Another said, "It is poison." The rumor spread quickly through the crowd. No one moved. Sergeant John Mitchell, who kept the daily log, called for a translator. The interpreter stepped forward, shouting in Japanese, explaining that it was ice cream, a treat from the American Supply Corps. The prisoners did not believe him. The sergeant shrugged, filled a cup, and began to eat it himself. Then he offered another to a man standing closest, a thin, sunburned sailor from Okinawa. The sailor hesitated, then took it. The spoon trembled in his hand. He placed it in his mouth. The effect was instant. His eyes widened. He swallowed. Then he smiled. The line of prisoners exhaled all at once, as if the entire yard had been holding its breath. Laughter followed, small at first, then growing louder. The guards relaxed, leaning against the truck. The machine churned slowly, mixing cream, sugar, and ice into a rhythm of peace. By the second round, the men were talking freely, trading words with the Americans they had once sworn to kill. The barriers of language cracked under the universal sound of joy. A young prisoner later wrote in his diary, "The first taste was like a dream of snow. I had forgotten that such a thing could exist." Another remembered how the guards smiled, not in triumph, but in something close to friendship. For men who had known only hunger and fear, the sweetness was unbearable. Some cried quietly, pretending it was from the cold. When the barrels were empty, Sergeant Mitchell noted the event in his logbook without flourish. Issued ice cream to prisoners. Good morale. No incidents. It was a line among thousands buried in paperwork. But for the men who had stood in that yard, it was a moment that reshaped the world. The ice melted within minutes under the sun. The memory did not. Those who tasted it carried the experience home across the ocean, into a country that had taught them Americans were beasts. They would tell others about the paper cups, the white sweetness, the strange feeling of being treated as human. What no speech or leaflet could have achieved, a handful of sugar and milk had done in a single afternoon. The weapon was not fear or punishment, but proof. Proof that the enemy they had been told to hate could offer kindness and expect nothing in return. In that heat, surrounded by wire and watchtowers, the empire of iron met the empire of ice, and one of them began to melt. The war had been fought with machines, with oceans of fuel and steel, yet in the end, what broke empires was not just the loss of weapons, but the collapse of belief. For the prisoners in Texas, the moment of collapse began with sweetness. The lesson was not about defeat. It was about the meaning of victory. In the weeks after the ice cream day, something subtle changed inside the fences. The prisoners began greeting the guards. They volunteered for work details. Some learned to fix engines and irrigation pumps. Others taught themselves English from old newspapers. A few started writing home through the Red Cross, describing the strange kindness of their captors. The officers tried to stop them, afraid those words would sound like betrayal. But it was already too late. The myth of American cruelty had dissolved, replaced by confusion, then by curiosity. For the American officers, this transformation was intentional. The War Department's psychological division had long believed that humane treatment would become the most effective propaganda. It was not only the right thing to do, it was strategy. Every satisfied prisoner was a message waiting to be carried back to Tokyo or Berlin. Every rumor of fair treatment would erode enemy morale faster than any bomb. The math of comfort worked like this: one camp, 500 men, 3 meals a day, thousands of letters home. Multiply that by 500 camps, and an army of witnesses begins to form. Men who can say truthfully that America fed them, healed them, and never lied. Each of those men became a quiet ambassador of defeat, carrying home an image of order and mercy that no propaganda could erase. By 1946, surveys of repatriated Japanese prisoners showed an astonishing result. More than 90% said they had positive impressions of their time in American hands. Many said they had come to respect their captors. Some even expressed gratitude. It was an outcome no general could have predicted. A war built on annihilation had ended with transformation. The prisoners returned not just alive, but changed. And the change spread, one conversation at a time, into a society that had once worshipped death. In the arithmetic of destruction, this was the inverse equation. Mercy multiplied, fear divided, hatred reduced to zero. America had proven that power could wear the face of decency and still win. The empire that believed compassion was weakness discovered, too late, that kindness, systematic, organized, and relentless, was stronger than any sword. When the war ended, the fences did not open immediately. Months passed before ships were ready to return the prisoners to their homeland. For many, those months were the most surreal of all. They were no longer enemies, but they were not yet free. They worked the fields, wrote letters, played baseball with guards. Some volunteered to help American officers dismantle parts of the camp, painting signs or loading supplies. The war outside had ended, but inside, a quiet human experiment was still unfolding. By early 1946, orders came for repatriation. The Japanese prisoners of Camp Hearne were to be transferred to the coast, then boarded onto American vessels bound for Yokohama. On the day of departure, the air smelled of rain and machine oil. Trucks carried them to the railhead, where an American band played a farewell march. It was not mockery, it was ritual. The guards saluted the departing men. The prisoners, awkward at first, saluted back. A few of them carried English notebooks, baseball gloves, even snapshots of their camp friends. One man had copied recipes he learned in the kitchen. Another had a dictionary with the word freedom circled. These were small, harmless things, yet they weighed more than medals. Weeks later, the ships reached Japan. The returning prisoners stepped onto the docks of Yokohama, a city half in ruins. Smoke still rose from distant neighborhoods. They were thinner than when they had left home, but healthier than anyone expected. American doctors had ensured every man was vaccinated, clean and clothed. The locals watching them from the harbor whispered in disbelief. These men were supposed to be ghosts, victims of American cruelty. Instead, they looked alive. When questioned by military officials, many of the former prisoners described their experience with caution. They spoke of order, of food, of strange fairness. Some said they had eaten better as captives than as soldiers of the emperor. Others told the story of the ice cream. Listeners called them liars. A few were beaten for spreading enemy propaganda, but the stories could not be contained. They passed quietly through villages, then into newspapers, then into rumor. Those accounts, impossible, shameful, undeniable, became the first cracks in Japan's wall of myth. They forced civilians to confront an unthinkable truth, that the enemy they had feared might have fought for something more stable, more livable than glory. In the years that followed, some of those men wrote memoirs. One former prisoner wrote, "I tasted defeat in Texas, but I learned humanity there. I saw a country that could make peace even in captivity." His words would echo decades later, when Japan rebuilt itself under the same ideals of order, efficiency, and abundance that had defined its conqueror. From the camps of Texas to the ashes of Hiroshima, the chain was invisible but unbroken. The lesson of the paper cup had traveled across the Pacific. Mercy had multiplied, and its consequences had become permanent. The empire that once believed compassion was fatal had, through defeat, been remade in its image. Across the fences of Texas and the plains of the South, another group of men lived a parallel story. They were German prisoners, tank crewmen from North Africa, U-boat sailors captured in the Atlantic, infantrymen taken in Normandy. Their camps looked much like the Japanese ones: wooden barracks, guard towers, mess halls, and fields of cotton or corn stretching to the horizon. Yet their experience revealed the same truth from a different angle: America's quiet mastery of order through mercy. At Camp Hearne, Germans and Japanese lived in separate sections. The Germans arrived earlier and adapted faster. They organized orchestras, theater troupes, and even classes in mathematics and engineering. On Sundays, they built makeshift altars and held services. The guards, mostly young Americans barely older than the prisoners, treated them with formality but not hatred. There were rules, and everyone understood them. When local farmers faced a shortage of labor, the War Department authorized POW work crews. The Germans harvested cotton, repaired irrigation lines, and built barns. The pay was recorded in their names, 80 cents a day, credited to the U.S. Treasury. It wasn't much, but it gave the men structure. At mealtimes, they ate beef, bread, and vegetables grown nearby. Sometimes townspeople saw them on the road, singing marching songs as they rode in trucks to the fields. At first, civilians watched in silence, uncertain how to react to enemies moving freely under the Texas sun. But curiosity softened suspicion. A farmer named Harold Turner invited a few German workers to his house one evening to help with repairs. His wife baked them cornbread. When the men returned to camp, they could not stop talking about it. By the following year, small gestures like that became common. Families brought food to the fence or exchanged polite greetings when they passed a work convoy. There were stories of friendships formed between captives and civilians, of letters exchanged long after the war. For many Americans, these men were no longer monsters. They were just young soldiers trapped in a conflict decided far above them. The Germans themselves began to see the contrast between what they had been told and what they experienced. Some had served under a regime that glorified domination and fear. In Texas, they saw a nation that glorified efficiency and fairness. The difference was crushing. A prisoner later wrote, "We lost not because they were crueler, but because they were better organized in everything, even kindness." While Germany's cities lay in ruins and its civilians starved on ration cards, its captured soldiers in America ate fresh meat and watched Hollywood films. That contradiction spread through every letter they sent home, every story they carried back. The world learned that America's power was not only industrial, it was cultural, moral, procedural. The lessons were the same, whether for German or Japanese captives. The United States had turned abundance into ideology. It had proven that a system built on rules could triumph over one built on fear. In the end, the barbed wire was less a prison than a mirror. Through it, the defeated saw what victory looked like, not in parades or medals, but in full plates and quiet order. And from that reflection, both sides began to understand what the war had truly been about. The war had begun with noise, with engines and gunfire, with flags and fury. It ended with silence, with the slow rhythm of order, and with a taste that refused to fade. The men who had once marched under the rising sun or the Iron Cross discovered, in defeat, a power greater than conquest. It was not steel, but ice. Not hate, but system. In the years that followed, many of them could not explain what had changed inside them. They had not been converted by speeches or politics. What they remembered were the ordinary things, the daily meals, the steady hands of doctors, the baseball games, the sound of music from a radio, and that impossible taste of ice cream under the Texas sun. Those moments were proof of something larger, that civilization could be efficient without cruelty, that strength could coexist with mercy. A Japanese prisoner once wrote, "I realized America won because it could afford to be kind." That sentence captured the quiet truth of the age. America's victory was not only military, it was logistical, industrial, moral. It showed that compassion, when organized and disciplined, could be more devastating than violence. In the ruins of Tokyo and Berlin, people rebuilt under those same principles: order, productivity, structure. The seeds had been planted not by occupying armies, but by the experience of those who had seen the machine of mercy up close. Back in Texas, Camp Hearne was dismantled. The barracks were sold as lumber, the fields plowed back into farmland. Only fragments of concrete and a few rusted fences remained. But the legacy of that place outlived its walls. The men who left it carried invisible cargo, memories of fairness, of abundance, of a nation that could turn morality into logistics. History would remember the great weapons, the bomb, the tank, the airplane. But the real symbol of victory was smaller, quieter, and sweet enough to melt in a paper cup. The empire that had believed mercy was weakness was undone by mercy's perfection. The systems that once manufactured war had, through discipline, produced peace. That was America's most dangerous invention, not the bomb, not the airplane, but the idea that decency could be scaled. And when those men closed their eyes years later, they no longer saw the barbed wire. They saw sunlight on melting ice, and they knew what had really won the war. The story of Camp Hearne ended quietly. The fences came down, the guards went home, and the land returned to cotton and silence. But the memory stayed alive in the men who had lived behind those wires. They carried it home across the Pacific, into cities of ash and hunger, into families that had been taught to hate. They spoke of ice cream, of fairness, of a world that ran on trust instead of terror. Their word spread faster than any army. Years later, as Japan rebuilt under American guidance, that lesson became visible in every factory line, every radio broadcast, every storefront filled with goods. The nation that had been broken by war learned how abundance could replace conquest. What began with a single scoop of sweetness in Texas had become a blueprint for peace. Mercy had proven itself measurable. Compassion had become a system. And when that system reached across oceans, it rebuilt not only cities, but civilizations. If this story surprised you, there's another waiting to be told. The next chapter in the history of America's edible weapons. It begins on the beaches of Normandy, where soldiers carried bottles of Coca-Cola into battle. The drink that followed the tanks became the taste of victory across a ruined continent. When you're ready, listen to how sugar conquered Europe.